You don't need a divorce or any assets, Jeffrey said, zipping his suitcase with a smug finality. Just accept it and move on. His smirk made my blood boil, but I kept my face neutral, watching my husband of 12 years pack up his life in our Chicago penthouse, like it was nothing more than a weekend getaway. His 21-year-old girlfriend Destiny was already waiting in a red convertible downstairs. Keep the house, Grace, but I'm not signing any papers or giving you a cent. I calmly replied, okay. He mistook my chilling silence for surrender. Have you ever been treated like a piece of old furniture, discarded after you sacrificed everything? Comment I have if you understand how I felt in that moment. Also, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The sound of the red convertible's engine faded into the distance, leaving nothing but a lingering scent of exhaust and the heavy, hollow silence of the penthouse. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood by the window watching the city lights of Chicago begin to flicker on, like an audience waiting for a show. Jeffrey thought he'd left a broken woman behind. He thought he'd outmaneuvered me by keeping me tethered to his name, while he played house with a girl who hadn't even been born when he started his first business. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I didn't even reach for a tissue. Instead, I pulled out my phone and sent a single, 3-word message to my legal and financial team. Phase 1 begins. The reply came back before I could even set the phone down. Everything is ready, awaiting the 14-day trigger. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of heavy red wine. The silence in the house didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt tactical. For 12 years, I had been the silent architect of Jeffrey's life. I was the one who managed the books for his luxury development firm. Technically, I was the firm's silent chief financial officer. I held the CPA license that gave his business legitimacy, while he acted as the public face. I didn't just manage the books. I built the financial fortress he claimed as his own, ensuring every tax filing was bulletproof until I decided it shouldn't be. I'd been the silent investor in his version of a family, footing the emotional bill, while he overdrafted my compassion until I had nothing left to give. Now, that was over. I opened my laptop and the glow of the screen was the only light in the room. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel panic. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon a single ounce of regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I began to activate the audit software I'd spent months quietly prepping. For years, I lived in a cage without songbirds or bars. The bars were made of my own loyalty. They were made of the sunk cost fallacy, the belief that if I just worked a little harder, if I just managed his liabilities a little better, he would finally see me. I was the survivor who had been chained by hope. But tonight, that chain had finally snapped. People often ask why the quiet ones stay so long. It's because we aren't waiting for things to get better. We are gathering data. We are documenting the rot in the foundation so that when we finally pull the trigger, the collapse is total. Jeffrey saw me as his legal safety net, a placeholder until something younger and shinier came along. He forgot that a safety net is also a web, and he was already tangled in it. I spent the next 4 hours reviewing his unauthorized transfers. He had bled $450,000 from our joint accounts to fund Destiny's social media lifestyle. He thought I wouldn't notice because I was too dramatic to understand the numbers. He was wrong. I understood them better than he ever did. I'd been living in the quiet for 7 days when the phone finally rang. I didn't even need to look at the screen to know it was him. Jeffrey's ringtone used to trigger a Pavlovian need in me to please, to fix, to accommodate. Now it was just a data point. I picked up, but I didn't say a word. I just hit the record button on my secondary device. The background noise was a cacophony of generic lounge music and the distinct clink of champagne flutes. He was at a high-end bar, probably celebrating his freedom with Destiny. Jeffrey didn't bother with a greeting. He skipped straight to the transaction. Grace, I'm sending over some documents via email. I need you to co-sign for the $10 million development deal with Gregory. It's the Gold Coast project. I took a slow, deliberate breath, enjoying the silence on my end. Why would I do that, Jeffrey? You left. Don't be difficult, he snapped, his voice sharp with that familiar condescension. You're living in a $5 million penthouse for free. I left you $15,000 in the joint account to play with. The least you can do is keep your tax signature on the firm's liabilities. Gregory needs to see stability, and your credit score is the only thing he trusts right now. He paused, then added a twist of the knife he'd been using for a decade. Look, let's be honest. You were always an anchor, Grace. Not the kind that keeps a ship steady, but the kind that drags it to the bottom. You were a subscription I paid for in boredom. Destiny understands the vision. She's the future. You're just the spreadsheets. So sign the papers Keep the roof over your head and let us move on. I stared at the recording levels jumping on my screen. I wondered why his insults didn't hurt anymore. Then I realized why I had stayed for 12 years. I was a victim of the sunk cost fallacy. In the world of auditing, we see it all the time, companies pouring millions into a failing project because they've already spent so much that they can't bear to walk away. I had treated my marriage like a turnaround project. I thought if I just invested more loyalty, more labor, and more silence, I could fix a foundation that was actually made of sand. I wasn't being loyal. I was just refusing to admit I'd made a bad investment. You really think my signature is just a formality, don't you know? I asked, my voice clinical. I think you're a sensible woman who knows she has nothing else going for her, he replied. Sign by Friday, or I'll have my lawyers start looking at how to evict you from my penthouse. Think about your ROI, Grace. You're lucky I'm even offering a cent. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my worth. I simply said, I'll give it the attention it deserves, Jeffrey. While Jeffrey was busy curating a new aesthetic for the world, I was busy curating the end of his. I scrolled through his social media in the dark of my office. He'd posted a photo of himself and Destiny at a private jet terminal. He was wearing a suit I'd bought him for our 10th anniversary, but he'd had it tailored to look younger. The caption read, "Finally living my truth. Out with the old, in with the gold." Destiny was leaning into him, wearing a diamond necklace that caught the flash of the camera. He looked smug. He looked like he'd outmaneuvered the woman who had spent 12 years keeping his secrets. What Jeffrey never understood was that I didn't just audit for the government. I had built the ledger of his luxury development firm from the ground up. I knew where every cent was buried because I was the one who had dug the holes. I didn't call him to scream about the photo. Anger is a loud, messy waste of energy. Instead, I triggered a formal lifestyle audit through the company's minority shareholders. I didn't frame it as a scorned wife looking for blood. I filed a formal whistleblower report with the SEC and the project's escrow bank, citing a massive breach of fiduciary duty. Under federal law, the evidence of unauthorized transfers I provided triggered an immediate, automatic freeze on all related accounts pending a criminal investigation. I framed it as a senior auditor concerned about significant irregularities in the escrow account for the $10 million Gold Coast project. The response from the board was immediate. Panic is the only language that travels faster than gossip in the Chicago real estate world. I sat at my desk with a cup of cold tea, the room smelling like ink and old paper. I didn't feel like a woman who had been cheated on. I felt like a technician dismantling a bomb. It took me precisely 6 hours of deep dive forensic accounting to find the hemorrhage, $450,000. Jeffrey made a fatal mistake. He diverted the Gold Coast project's escrow funds into our joint personal account first, disguised as consulting dividends, before moving them to his shell companies. By doing this, he didn't just steal from Gregory. He unwittingly made me a primary witness to a federal crime of money laundering. His trail was sloppy. Jeffrey had moved the funds under the guise of pre-construction consulting fees to a shell company. But his trail was sloppy. He was so blinded by his own narcissistic glow that he assumed nobody would look closer. I traced that $450,000 straight to a luxury dealership and a jewelry boutique. He hadn't just had an affair. He had committed a systematic breach of fiduciary duty. He had used investor capital to bankroll Destiny's social media influencer dreams. He bought her a custom SUV and enough gold to make her shine for the cameras. In my profession, we have a saying, the numbers never lie, but the people holding them always do. The paper felt heavy in my hands, the kind of expensive, textured stock used for legal documents that are supposed to be ironclad. I sat in my lawyer's office, the morning light cutting through the high windows of the Chicago skyscraper, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, frantic witnesses. We were looking at a set of home equity withdrawal forms for the penthouse. The total was $350,000. I didn't need a forensics lab to see the problem. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It said Grace in a neat, practiced script. But the slant was wrong. The pressure on the pen hadn't been mine. Jeffrey had spent 12 years watching me sign every check and tax return. But even his arrogance couldn't perfectly replicate the way I cross my T's when I'm tired. He thought he could hide behind the old power of attorney I'd granted him years ago for the business. He didn't realize that I had legally revoked every shred of his authority the very hour he walked out that door. He wasn't just forging a signature. He was committing a felony by bypassing a legal termination of his access. He forged it, I said, my voice sounding like footsteps on gravel. It wasn't a question. My lawyer, a woman who had seen the worst of humanity through mahogany desks, leaned forward. He cracked the moment our investigator presented the digital audit trail, the GPS pings, and the IP address from the electronic filing he thought was untraceable. He admitted Jeffrey paid him $5,000 to look the other way while he forged your name. I leaned back in the chair, feeling a strange, hollow sort of peace. For weeks, a small part of me, the part that remembered the man I married 12 years ago, had felt a twinge of guilt. I'd wondered if my systematic audit of his life was too much, if my coldness was a symptom of my own hurt, but seeing that forged signature changed the chemistry of my blood. This wasn't a man who had made a mistake. This wasn't a man who had simply fallen in love with a younger woman. Jeffrey had been planning this for months. He had stood in our kitchen, kissed my cheek, and asked about my day, all while he was bribing officials to steal the equity from the roof over my head. He didn't just want to leave me. He wanted to bankrupt me. He wanted to make sure that by the time I realized he was gone, I would be standing in an empty shell of a life, with no resources to fight back. He had treated our marriage like a hostile takeover. He viewed my loyalty as an asset to be liquidated, and my trust as a vulnerability to be exploited. He didn't just overdraft my compassion. He attempted to forge my life away. "The criminal complaint is ready," my lawyer said, pulling a new set of papers toward her. "Forgery, identity theft, and grand larceny. On top of the escrow fraud you found in the firm's books, he's looking at a minimum of 5 to 7 years. I stood up and smoothed the front of my navy suit. The fabric felt crisp, efficient. "Good," I said. "Send it. No more warnings, no more 2-week grace periods. The audit is complete." The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a sea of black ties, silk gowns, and the suffocating scent of expensive perfume and unearned confidence. Jeffrey stood in the center of a circle of Chicago's most influential developers, his hand resting possessively on the small of Destiny's back. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car, looking every bit the high-powered mogul he had spent 12 years pretending to be. I watched him from the shadows of the mezzanine, a spectator at the funeral of his own ambition. The charity auction was the centerpiece of the evening, a carefully choreographed dance of ego and philanthropy. Jeffrey was desperate to impress Gregory, the lead investor who held the keys to the $10 million Gold Coast deal. I saw him lean in, whispering something to Destiny that made her laugh. Her youth, a trophy he displayed to hide his own fading relevance. He was basking in the narcissistic glow of a man who believed he had outrun his past. To a narcissist like Jeffrey, an audience isn't a group of people. It's a mirror. He didn't love Destiny. He loved the way he looked in her eyes, young, powerful, and untouchable. Next up, the auctioneer's voice rang through the hall, is a rare vintage collection from the Napa Valley, donated by the Peterson estate. We'll start the bidding at $20,000. Jeffrey didn't hesitate. He wanted the spotlight. He wanted Gregory to see him as a peer, not a subordinate. $30,000, Jeffrey called out, raising his paddle with a flourish. The room murmured with approval. A rival developer raised the bid to $40,000. Jeffrey's jaw tightened. This wasn't about wine anymore. It was about dominance. $50,000, Jeffrey shouted. The hammer fell. Sold to Jeffrey Henderson for $50,000. A round of applause rippled through the ballroom. Jeffrey walked toward the stage with the swagger of a conqueror. He pulled out the gold card, the one linked to the home equity account he had forged my name to access. I stepped out of the shadows and began my descent down the grand staircase. I didn't rush. I wanted to savor the moment the mask began to slip. "I'm sorry, sir," the gala treasurer whispered, her voice carrying just enough for the front row to hear. "There seems to be an issue. The transaction was declined." Jeffrey's smile didn't just fade. It curdled. "That's impossible. Try it again. It's a high-limit account." "I've tried 3 times, Mr. Henderson. The account is flagged as frozen due to a pending fraud investigation." The silence that followed was absolute. I reached the bottom of the stairs just as Jeffrey turned, his face a mask of purple-veined fury. He saw me, and for a second his bravado flickered. I wasn't the anchor in the navy suit anymore. I was wearing a floor-length silver gown that caught every light in the room. I looked luminous. I looked like the one thing he could no longer afford to control. "Grace?" he hissed, his voice cracking. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything, Jeffrey." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a manila folder, handing it directly to Gregory, who had been watching the scene with narrowed eyes. "Gregory, you might want to review the forensic audit of your escrow funds. It seems Jeffrey has been using your investment to bankroll his new beginning." Jeffrey lunged toward me, but a heavy hand landed on his shoulder. It was Gregory. But he wasn't looking at Jeffrey with anger, he was looking at Destiny. "It's okay, Dad," Destiny said, her voice stripped of the vapid socialite tone she had used for months. She stepped away from Jeffrey and stood beside her father. I've got the rest of the transfer logs on my phone. Grace was right. He's been bleeding the project dry since the day he hired me. I didn't need your jewelry or your cars. Jeffrey, every cent you spent on me was documented and transferred directly into an evidence escrow account managed by my father's attorneys. You thought you were buying a trophy? You were actually funding your own indictment? The room spun. Jeffrey looked from Destiny to Gregory, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Destiny hadn't been his conquest. She was a double agent. Gregory had suspected Jeffrey's midlife crisis was a financial liability and had sent his own daughter in to document the rot from the inside. Jeffrey wasn't a predator. He was the mark. What we were witnessing was a total narcissistic injury. For a man like Jeffrey, the loss of money is a setback, but the loss of the illusion of power is a death. His card being declined in front of the people he most wanted to impress was the ultimate humiliation. In the high-stakes world of Chicago development, your reputation is your only real currency. In 60 seconds, Jeffrey went from the golden boy to a toxic liability that no one in this room would ever touch again. His ego, built on a foundation of stolen credit and forged signatures, was shattering in real time. He looked smaller, older, and pathetically common. "Get him out of here," Gregory said, his voice cold and final. "And call the district attorney. I want my $450,000 back, and I want him in a cell." 3 months after the signatures were verified, and the divorce was finalized, the dust finally settled on the ruins of Jeffrey's empire. I stood in my new kitchen, the morning sun pouring over the marble counters, reading a final update from my legal team. Jeffrey had been asked to leave the firm effective immediately. Gregory didn't want to partner with compromised ethics managing $10 million development deals. With a mountain of evidence Gregory and I provided, Jeffrey didn't even risk a trial. He took a plea deal and traded his designer suits for an orange jumpsuit faster than he ever thought possible. He's currently serving the first year of his sentence in a federal facility with no possibility of parole. His brother's spare room is where his belongings sit, in cardboard boxes, a fittingly small inheritance for a man who tried to steal an empire. I closed my laptop and let out a breath I'd been holding for 12 years. I didn't feel the surge of joy I expected, just a profound sense of peace. Life has a way of balancing the books, when you stop letting people overdraw on your kindness. That afternoon, I walked through my home. My home. Every room had been redone to match my soul, not his ego. The dark, heavy leather furniture Jeffrey insisted on was gone, replaced by bright, airy pieces that made me feel like I could finally breathe. His old office, the place where he used to pick apart my achievements until I felt small, was now a yoga room. It was a quiet space for me to heal and reconnect with the woman I had suppressed for over a decade. The walls that once displayed his business awards now held art I'd bought during my travels, something I'd always wanted to do but never did for his sake. I've come to realize that I wasn't just loyal to Jeffrey. I was loyal to a version of him that never existed. I was the silent investor in a fraudulent dream. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that being sensible and compliant is often just a slow way to disappear. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free from the debt of their expectations. I've started hosting a support group in the old dining room for women who are rebuilding their lives from the ground up. Seeing them find their strength reminds me that the hardest moments often reveal our truest foundations. I used to think revenge was about the red convertible or the public exposure, but I was wrong. The best revenge is simply becoming the version of yourself that the betrayer no longer has the credentials to even talk to. I looked out at the balcony where the spring flowers were starting to bloom. The woman Jeffrey left behind no longer exists. In her place is someone who will never underestimate herself again. I'm no longer an anchor. I'm the architect. If Grace's journey reminded you of your own strength, hit that like button. Share this with one person who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by a betrayer's opinion. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice served. Remember, you are not a pawn. You are the creator of your own life.